Hey everyone. Today, we're taking a closer look at one of the most unusual ground attack aircraft of World War II. In modern discussions about World War II aviation, attention often goes to famous fighters and bombers, the B-109, the Spitfire, the B-17, or the Ju-87 Stuka. Yet hidden beneath these legends is a brutal, uncomfortable, and deeply flawed aircraft that was designed for one purpose only: to fly straight into enemy fire and survive long enough to destroy targets on the ground. That aircraft was the Henschel HS-129. The HS-129 was not elegant. It was not fast. Pilots did not love it. In fact, many feared it. But despite its shortcomings, it became one of Germany's most dedicated ground attack aircraft, a flying armored box built to hunt tanks at extremely low altitude. This is the story of an aircraft that sacrificed almost everything: speed, comfort, and visibility in exchange for armor and firepower. The need for a flying tank killer. By the late 1930s, German military planners were already thinking ahead to the next war. They expected fast-moving ground campaigns supported by aircraft operating close to the front lines. These aircraft would have to attack tanks, artillery, supply columns, and infantry positions, all while flying low and slow under intense enemy fire. Existing aircraft were not ideal for this role. Fighters were too lightly built. Dive bombers like the Ju-87 were accurate but vulnerable. What the Luftwaffe wanted was a dedicated Schlachtflugzeug, a ground attack aircraft designed from the start to absorb punishment. The Reich Air Ministry issued a requirement for a heavily armored twin-engined aircraft capable of operating at low altitude and surviving concentrated small arms and anti-aircraft fire. Henschel answered that call. Design philosophy: armor first, everything else second. From the very beginning, the HS-129 was designed around one central idea: pilot survivability. The cockpit was not built like a traditional aircraft canopy. Instead, it was a steel armored tub made of thick armored plates surrounding the pilot from almost every direction. The windshield consisted of thick armored glass blocks, offering only a narrow forward view. This design choice had consequences. Pilot visibility was extremely limited. Side and downward vision were poor, making landing, navigation, and target acquisition difficult. Flying the HS-129 required intense concentration and physical endurance. But in theory, the pilot inside this armored shell would survive hits that would destroy other aircraft. First flight and early problems. The HS-129 first flew in 1939, just as Europe stood on the brink of war. Almost immediately, problems appeared. The aircraft was underpowered. Early versions used French Gnome-Rhone radial engines, which were unreliable and struggled to lift the heavy armored airframe. Takeoffs were long and dangerous, especially from rough forward airfields. Handling was poor. The aircraft was stable as a gun platform, but sluggish in turns and climbs. If enemy fighters appeared, escape was unlikely. Even worse, the cockpit environment was miserable. Pilots described it as cramped, hot, and exhausting. The narrow armored windows made situational awareness extremely difficult. But despite all this, the Luftwaffe pressed forward. Baptism of fire on the Eastern Front. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, vast armored formations and open terrain created exactly the conditions the aircraft had been designed for. Soviet ground fire was intense, but fighter opposition was often limited, especially early in the war. Flying at treetop height, HS-129 pilots attacked tanks, artillery positions, and vehicle columns with cannons, bombs, and rockets. Their armored cockpits saved lives. Many aircraft returned with dozens of bullet holes. However, the cost was high. Losses mounted due to mechanical failures, navigation errors, and increasingly capable Soviet fighters. The aircraft's lack of speed made it an easy target if intercepted. At this point in the story, if you're enjoying this deep dive into one of the most unusual World War II aircraft, make sure to subscribe to the channel. More detailed aviation documentaries like this one are coming, covering both famous machines and forgotten designs. Don't forget to like the video, it really helps the channel grow. Now, let's continue. The Tank Buster: Heavy Weapons and Extreme Solutions. As the war progressed, the HS-129 received increasingly powerful weapons. Some variants were armed with 30mm cannons, while later versions carried massive 37 and even 75mm anti-tank guns. These weapons could destroy Soviet armor with a single well-placed shot, but recoil was severe. Accuracy required steady flight and perfect alignment. Pilots had only seconds to attack before ground fire became overwhelming. The aircraft became more of a specialized tool, devastating when conditions were right, nearly helpless when they were not. Decline and legacy. By 1944, the HS-129 was obsolete. Enemy fighters dominated the skies. Fuel shortages limited training and operations. More flexible aircraft like the FW-190F took over the ground attack role. Production ended and surviving aircraft were gradually withdrawn. Yet the HS-129 left a lasting legacy. It proved that dedicated ground attack aircraft could survive intense fire if properly armored. Its design philosophy would later influence post-war attack aircraft concepts, including the idea of sacrificing speed for protection, a lesson still visible in modern aircraft like the A-10 Thunderbolt. Conclusion: a brutal aircraft for a brutal war. The Henschel HS-129 was not a success in the traditional sense. It was difficult to fly, uncomfortable, and dangerous. Pilots did not love it, but it was never meant to be loved. It was meant to fly low, take hits, and destroy tanks, and in that narrow role, it succeeded often enough to earn its place in aviation history. The HS-129 remains a symbol of how far designers were willing to go when survival depended on armor, firepower, and sheer determination. Part 2. Steel Coffin or Tank Hunter. By the middle years of the war, the HS-129 had already earned a grim reputation among those who flew it. While official reports praised its survivability and firepower, pilot memoirs often told a darker story, one of exhaustion, fear, and constant compromise. It was doing exactly what it had been designed to do, but at a tremendous cost. Life inside the armored cockpit. Flying the HS-129 was unlike flying almost any other combat aircraft of the Second World War. The cockpit was extremely cramped, the armored walls pressed in tightly around the pilot, leaving little room to move. The visibility through the thick armored glass was narrow and distorted, especially at the edges. In combat, pilots often felt isolated from the outside world, relying on instinct and brief glimpses of terrain rushing beneath them. Heat was another major issue. The armored cockpit trapped warmth and ventilation was poor. During long missions, especially in summer, temperatures inside could become unbearable. Sweat, fatigue, and dehydration were constants. Yet there was one undeniable advantage. When ground fire erupted, rifle bullets, machine guns, and light anti-aircraft weapons, the armored tub often did its job. Pilots returned with stories of bullets striking the cockpit with dull metallic thuds, leaving dents instead of wounds. In those moments, the HS-129 earned its purpose. Tactical use and battlefield reality. The HS-129 was never meant to operate alone. In theory, it was supposed to work alongside fighters and other attack aircraft, striking enemy armor just before or during major ground offensives. In practice, reality was far harsher. On the Eastern Front, weather was unpredictable, navigation was difficult, and frontline airfields were often little more than muddy strips. Mechanical failures were common, especially with the unreliable engines. Many aircraft were lost without ever encountering the enemy. When missions did succeed, they were terrifyingly intense. HS-129 pilots typically approached their targets at very low altitude, sometimes below treetop level. Attacks were fast and violent, a short burst of cannon fire, a quick release of bombs, and then an attempt to escape while enemy fire filled the air. There was little room for error. A damaged engine or a poorly timed attack could be fatal. The heavy gun experiments. As Soviet armor became more numerous and better protected, German engineers sought even more extreme solutions. The HS-129 became a testbed for increasingly powerful weapons. The most famous of these was the massive 75mm cannon adapted from an anti-tank gun. Mounted under the fuselage, it gave the aircraft the ability to destroy almost any tank it encountered. On paper, it was devastating. In reality, it pushed the aircraft to its absolute limits. The recoil was immense. The additional weight further reduced speed and maneuverability. Pilots had to fly straight and level during firing, making them extremely vulnerable to ground fire and fighters. Only the most experienced pilots were trusted with such variants, and even they considered the weapon more psychological than practical. Still, the image of a slow, armored aircraft firing artillery-sized shells from the air became one of the most extreme expressions of World War II desperation. Enemy response and decline. By late 1943 and into 1944, the battlefield had changed dramatically. The Red Air Force had grown stronger, better organized, and more aggressive. Soviet fighters now patrolled the skies in large numbers, and the slow HS-129 became an increasingly easy target. At the same time, German resources were stretched thin. Fuel shortages limited training, spare parts became scarce. New pilots lacked the experience needed to survive low-level attack missions. Losses mounted. Gradually, the Luftwaffe shifted toward more versatile aircraft like the FW-190F and G, which, while less armored, were faster, more flexible, and better able to defend themselves. The HS-129, once seen as a specialized solution, began to fade from the front lines. Pilot's verdict. Perhaps the most telling judgment of the HS-129 comes not from official statistics, but from the men who flew it. Few pilots spoke of affection for the aircraft. Many described it as exhausting, dangerous, and unforgiving. Yet there was also a strange respect, an understanding that the aircraft had been built for a mission no one else wanted. It was not elegant, it was not comfortable, but it was purpose-built. For a brief moment in the war, that purpose mattered. A concept ahead of its time. Although the HS-129 ultimately failed to change the course of the war, its underlying concept would not disappear. The idea of a slow, heavily armored ground attack aircraft designed to absorb punishment while supporting troops would resurface decades later. Cold War planners revisited many of the same questions: how to survive over the battlefield, how to destroy armor, and how to keep pilots alive under fire. In that sense, the HS-129 was not merely a failed experiment, it was an early, brutal lesson. Final reflection. Built for the worst war. The Henschel HS-129 was a product of its time, a time when engineers were asked to solve impossible problems with limited technology and unlimited urgency. It was born from fear of enemy fire, shaped by armor and guns, and flown by men who understood that survival depended as much on luck as on design. The aircraft did not become a legend in the traditional sense. It did not inspire admiration or awe. Instead, it stands as a reminder of the realities of close air support in World War II: dirty, dangerous, and unforgiving. The HS-129 was never meant to dominate the skies. It was meant to fly into hell, stay there just long enough, and come back, if it could. And sometimes, against all odds, it did. If you made it this far, thank you for watching and listening. Stories like the Henschel Hs 129 remind us that aviation history is not only about victories and legends, but also about hard choices, flawed designs, and the people who flew them anyway. If you enjoy detailed military aviation documentaries like this one, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. More stories, both famous and forgotten, are coming. Until next time,